Hello, darlings. Welcome back to The Gentleman Psychic. 1 second, I have to adjust a few things before I go and share that I'm on the Facebook. I'm a little red, and I'll tell you why in a second. But first, I have to do this because you know what? When I'm doing Scared and Alone, when I'm on Scared and Alone, I do with Restream and then it connects everything. But when I am doing my own thing, I do not. And I really need to. I'm not paid to say that. It's just what I need to. Okay, join me. Join me live as we continue reading through the looking glass. Post it now, and then I'm going to go over and share it on one more page, and then we can begin. Let me just make certain that it's here. Share to your page. There we go. Join me now live, and we'll share it to your story, and we'll share it to your page's story. Hi, Matthew. Good to see you. Oh, yes, tomorrow is going to be a good class. For those of you who are joining tomorrow, we're going to be talking about chaos magic tomorrow. So you can do that through Patreon under University Magicus. So you can find me over there, and that's what's amazing. Hello, Duke. Good to see you. Christy, hello. Scotty Dahani, good evening. I am a little bit, oops, 1 second. I always forget when that happens. So do not be as I do, children, because this morning I got up and I did not put on my moisturizer, my sunscreen that I normally do. And then I thought, well, I'll come down and have some tea. And then, that's sort of how I normally do things. And then if I go out, I'll wear a hat. Well, I didn't wear a hat. I went out. I was doing some things out in the garden today. And I stood there with a friend of mine as we were working on this thing together, and I got a little bit pink. So it is not just the reflection of the red. I am more pink than usual. Hopefully it will be hopefully it will smooth itself out before too long. Matthew says chaos is how I started 5 years ago. Well, it's quite a powerful path. I'm not going to go into much of that right now because that is for tomorrow's class. So but yes, it is going to be exciting. I look forward to seeing what you have to say in it as well. As you know, I like to open it up to the floor and have questions, comments, things that I missed. Today, I would like to say a little special hello to my friend Nathaniel. I'm sorry, I think it's Nathaniel. Nathan, who was out today watching Into the Woods with my very good friend, his mother, Courtney Buckley. So you would normally be seeing Courtney at this time. If you would join me for Scared and Alone, you would be seeing Courtney right now. And they said that they were getting out just about this time. So they wanted to make certain that on the way home that they were listening to Through the Looking Glass. So that's a little bit of announcement there. What else do I have going on? Yes. Tomorrow, again, one more time, Courtney's son, he's awesome. He is awesome. Hello, Mary Jane. Good to see you. Yes, so Scotty Dahadi says, what time is the class tomorrow? Class tomorrow is at 2, I believe. Mary Jane or Matthew, you can feel free to correct me. I think it's at 2 o'clock tomorrow. Now, it's not going to be here on my YouTube channel. It's actually going to be under Patreon University Magicus. So if you would like, yes, 2 o'clock on the Pacific coast, I think. No, on the East Coast, which is where I am. 2 o'clock tomorrow here. I think it's 2 o'clock tomorrow here. Oh goodness, I feel like I need. Let me just verify that. Let me just look and see. It should be in my calendar for tomorrow. Let's find out. Okay, tomorrow, the 24th. Okay, yes, tomorrow 2 p.m. Pacific time, 5 p.m. here on the East Coast. So, depending upon where you are, 5 New York time, 2 o'clock California time. So, wherever you are, that's where it is. And Matthew says, yes, 2, looking at the chat. Yes, it is tomorrow at 2 California Pacific time, 5 p.m. Eastern. So anyway, there's that. And 4 Central Standard, yes. So wherever you are, join us tomorrow, universitymagicist.com, and we'll be talking about chaos magic and practices, rituals. Also, I didn't tell everyone, but bring a pencil, bring a piece of paper. We're going to be starting to make some sigils as well for tomorrow, so that will be a fun one. I guess that's all of my announcements for now. Do all the whole YouTube thing, the like, the subscribe, the shares, the comments. They always do help. So it is so good to have you here on this Saturday night. And without further ado, my beauties, I want you to relax. I want you to get a nice drink. If you are driving, please do not relax too much. But if you are at home, make certain that you are nice and relaxed. Have a nice drink, have a nice blanket, have a nice fan if it's warm, have a nice heater if it's cold. Anyway, with that, I think we should go ahead and begin through the looking glass where we left off. Chapter 4. As we left off, it is, but in another moment she recovered herself, feeling sure that they must be Tweedledum and Tweedledee. Chapter 4. They were standing under a tree, each with an arm around the other's neck, and Alice knew which was which in a moment because one of them had D-U-M embroidered on his collar and the other D-E-E. I suppose they've got each other Tweedle around the back of the collar, she said to herself. They stood so still that she quite forgot they were alive, and she was just looking round to see if the word Tweedle was written at the back of each collar when she was startled by a voice coming from the one marked Dumb. "If you think we're waxworks," he said, "you ought to pay, you know. Waxworks weren't made to be looked at for nothing, nohow." "Contrariwise," added the one marked D, "if you think we're alive, you ought to speak." "I'm sure I'm very sorry," was all Alice could say, for the words of the old song kept ringing through her head like the ticking of a clock, and she could hardly help saying them out loud. Tweedledum and Tweedledee agreed to have a battle, for Tweedledum said Tweedledee had spoiled his nice new rattle. Just then flew down a monstrous crow, as black as tar barrel, which frightened both the heroes so, they quite forgot the quarrel. "I know what you're thinking about," said Tweedledum, "but it isn't so nohow." "Contrariwise," continued Tweedledee, "if it was so, it might be, and if it were so, it would be. But as it isn't, it ain't. That's logic." "I was thinking," Alice said very politely, which is the very best way out of this wood? It's getting so dark. Would you tell me, please?" But the little men only looked at each other and grinned. They looked so exactly like a couple of great schoolboys that Alice couldn't help pointing her finger at Tweedledum and saying, "First boy." "No how," Tweedledum cried out briskly, and shut his mouth up again with a snap. "Next boy," said Alice, passing on to Tweedledee, though she felt quite certain he would only shout "Contrariwise," and so he did. "You've begun wrong," cried Tweedledum. "The first thing in a visit is to say how d'ye do, and shake hands." And here the two brothers gave each other a hug, and then they held out two hands that were free to shake hands with her. Alice did not like shaking hands with either of them first, for fear of hurting the other one's feelings. So, as the best way out of the difficulty, she took hold of both hands at once. The next moment they were dancing round in a ring. This seemed quite natural, she remembered afterwards, and she was not even surprised to hear music playing. It seemed to come from the tree under which they were dancing, and it was done as well as she could make it out by the branches rubbing once across the other like fiddles and fiddlesticks. But it certainly was funny, Alice said afterwards, when she was telling her sister the history of all of this, to find myself singing "Here We Go Round the Mulberry Bush." I don't know when I began it, but somehow I felt as if I'd been singing it a long, long time. The other two dancers were fat and very soon out of breath. 4 times round is enough for one dance, Tweedledum panted out, and they left off dancing as suddenly as they had begun. The music stopped at the same moment. Then they let go of Alice's hands and stood looking at her for a minute. There was a rather awkward pause, as Alice didn't know how to begin a conversation with people she had just been dancing with. It would never do to say, "How do you do now?" she said to herself. "We seem to have got beyond that somehow. I hope you're not much tired," she said at last. "No, how, and thank you very much for asking," said Tweedledum. "So much obliged," added Tweedledee. "You like poetry?" "Yes, pretty well. Some poetry," Alice said doubtfully. "Would you tell me which road leads out of the wood?" "What shall I repeat to her?" said Tweedledee, looking round at Tweedledum with great solemn eyes, and not noticing Alice's question. "The Walrus and the Carpenter is the longest," Tweedledum replied, giving his brother an affectionate hug. Tweedledee began instantly. "The sun was shining." Here Alice ventured to interrupt him. "It's very long," she said, as politely as she could. "Would you please tell me first which road?" Tweedledum smiled gently and began again. "The sun was shining on the sea, shining with all his might. He did his very best to make the billows smooth and bright. And this was odd, because it was the middle of the night. The moon was shining sulkily, because she thought the sun had got no business to be there. After the day was done, 'It's very rude of him,' she said, 'to come and spoil the fun.' The sea was wet as wet could be. The sands were dry as dry. You could not see a cloud because no cloud was in the sky. No birds were flying overhead. There were no birds to fly. The Walrus and the Carpenter were walking close at hand. They wept like anything to see such quantities of sand. If this were only cleared away, they said, it would be grand. If 7 maids with 7 mops swept it for half a year, do you suppose, the Walrus said, that they could get it clear? I doubt it, said the Carpenter, and shed a bitter tear. Oh, oysters, come and walk with us, the Walrus did beseech. A pleasant walk, a pleasant talk, along the briny beach. We cannot do with more than 4, to give a hand to each. The eldest oyster looked at him, but never a word he said. The eldest oyster winked his eye and shook his heavy head, meaning to say he did not choose to leave the oyster bed. But 4 young oysters hurried up, all eager for the treat. Their coats were brushed, their faces washed, their shoes were clean and neat. And this was odd, because, you know, they hadn't any feet. 4 other oysters followed them, and yet another 4. And thick and fast they came at last, and more and more and more. and hoping, the frothy waves, through the frothy waves, and scrambling to the shore. The walrus and the carpenter walked on a mile or so, and they rested on a rock, conveniently low, and all the little oysters stood and waited in a row. The time has come, the walrus said, to talk of many things, of shoes and ships and sealing wax and cabbages and kings, and why the sea is boiling hot, and whether pigs have wings. But wait a bit, the oysters cried, before we have our chat, for some of us are out of breath, and all of us are fat. No hurry, said the carpenter. They thanked him very much for that. A loaf of bread, the walrus said, it is what we chiefly need. Pepper and vinegar besides are very good indeed. Now, if you're ready, oysters dear, we can begin to feed. But not on us, the oysters cried, turning a little blue. After such kindness, that would be a dismal thing to do. The night is fine, the walrus said. Do you admire the view? It was so kind of you to come, and you are very nice, the carpenter said nothing but. Cut us another slice. I wish you were not quite so deaf. I've had to ask you twice. It seems a shame, the walrus said, to play them such a trick, after we've brought them out so far and made them trot so quick. The carpenter said nothing but, the butter's spread too thick. I weep for you, the walrus said. I deeply sympathize. With sobs and tears he sorted out those of the largest size, holding his pocket handkerchief before his streaming eyes. Oh, oysters, said the carpenter, you've had a pleasant run. Shall we be trotting home again? But answer came there none. And that was scarcely odd, because they had eaten every one. I like the walrus best, said Alice, because you see, he was a little sorry for the poor oysters. He ate more than the carpenter, though, said Tweedledee. You see, he held his handkerchief in front so that the carpenter couldn't count how many he took. Counterwise, contrariwise. That's what I mean, said Alice indignantly. Then I like the carpenter best, if he didn't eat so many as the walrus. But he ate as many as he could get, said Tweedledum. This was a puzzler. After a pause, Alice began. Well, they were both very unpleasant characters. Here she checked herself in some alarm at hearing something that sounded to her like the puffing of a large steam engine in the wood near them, though she feared it was more likely to be a wild beast. Are there any lions or tigers about here? She asked timidly. It's only the Red King snoring, said Tweedledee. Come and look at him. The brothers cried, and they each took one of Alice's hands and led her up to where the king was sleeping. Isn't he a lovely sight? Said Tweedledum. Alice couldn't say honestly that he was. He had a tall red nightcap on with a tassel. He was lying crumpled up in a sort of untidy heap and snoring loudly. Fit to snore his head off, as Tweedledum remarked. I'm afraid he'll catch cold with lying on a damp grass, said Alice, who was a very thoughtful little girl. He's dreaming now, said Tweedledee. And what do you think he's dreaming about? Alice said, Nobody can guess that. Why, about you, Tweedledee exclaimed, clapping his hands triumphantly. And if he left off dreaming about you, where do you suppose you'd be? Where I am now, of course, said Alice. Not you, Tweedledee retorted contemptuously. You'd be nowhere. Why, you're only a sort of a thing in his dream. Is that their king? If that their king was to wake, added Tweedledum, you'd go out, bang, just like a candle. I shouldn't. Alice exclaimed indignantly. Besides, if I'm only a sort of thing in his dream, what are you? I should like to know. Ditto, said Tweedledum. Ditto, ditto, cried Tweedledee. He shouted this so loud as Alice couldn't help saying, Hush! You'll be waking him. I'm afraid if you make so much noise. Well, it's no use your talking about waking him, said Tweedledum, when you're only one of the things in his dream. You know very well you're not real. I am too real, said Alice, and began to cry. You won't make yourself a bit really You won't make yourself a bit realer by crying, Tweedledee remarked. There's nothing to cry about. If I wasn't real, said Alice, half laughing through her tears, it all seemed so ridiculous, I shouldn't be able to cry. I hope you don't suppose those are real tears, Tweedledum interrupted in a tone of great contempt. I know they're talking nonsense, Alice thought to herself, and it's foolish to cry about it. So she brushed away her tears and went on as cheerfully as she could. At any rate, I'd better be getting out of the wood, for really it's coming on very dark. Do you think it's going to rain? Tweedledum spread a large umbrella over himself and his brother and looked up into it. No, I don't think it is, he said. At least not under here. No how. But it may rain outside. It may, if it chooses, said Tweedledee. We've no objection, contrariwise. Selfish things, thought Alice, and she was just going to say good night and leave them when Tweedledum sprang out from under the umbrella and seized her by the wrist. Do you see that? He said in a voice choking with passion, and his eyes grew large and yellow all in a moment as he pointed with a trembling finger at a small white thing lying under a tree. It's only a rattle, Alice said after a careful examination of the little white thing. Not a rattlesnake, you know, she added hastily, thinking that it was frightened. Only an old rattle, quite old and broken. I knew it was, cried Tweedledum, beginning to stamp about wildly and tear his hair. It's spoilt, of course. Here he looked at Tweedledee, who immediately sat down on the ground and tried to hide himself under the umbrella. Alice laid her hand upon his arm and said in a soothing tone, You needn't be so angry about an old rattle. But it isn't old, Tweedledum cried in a greater fury than ever. It's new, I tell you. I bought it yesterday. My nice new rattle. And his voice rose to a perfect scream. All this time, Tweedledee was trying his best to fold up the umbrella with himself in it, which was such an extraordinary thing to do, that it quite took off Alice's attention from the angry brother. But he couldn't quite succeed, and it ended in his rolling over, bundled up in the umbrella, with only his head out, and there he lay, opening and shutting his mouth and his large eyes, looking more like a fish than anything else, Alice thought. Of course you agreed to have a battle, Tweedledum said in a calmer tone. I suppose so. I suppose so, the other sulkily replied, as he crawled out of the umbrella. Only she must help us to dress up, you know. So the two brothers went off hand in hand into the wood and returned in a minute with their arms full of things, such as bolsters, blankets, hearth rugs, tablecloths, dish covers, and coal scuttles. I hope you're good at hand pinning and tying strings, Tweedledum remarked. Every one of these things has got to go on somehow or another. Alice said afterwards she had never seen such a fuss made about anything in all her life. The way those two bustled about, and the quantity of things they put on, and the trouble they gave her in tying strings and fastening buttons. Really, they'll be more like bundles of old clothes than anything else by the time they're ready, she said to herself as she arranged a bolster around the neck of Tweedledee, to keep his head from being cut off, as he said. You know, he added very gravely, it's one of the most serious things that can possibly happen to one in battle, to get one's head cut off. Alice laughed aloud, but she managed to turn it into a cough for fear of hurting his feelings. "Do I look very pale?" said Tweedledum, coming up to have his helmet tied on. He called it a helmet, though it certainly looked more like a saucepan. "Well, yes, a little," Alice replied gently. "I'm very brave generally," he went on in a low voice, "only today I happen to have a headache." "And I've got a toothache," said Tweedledee, who had overheard the remark. "I'm far worse than you." "Then you'd better not fight today," said Alice, thinking a good opportunity to make peace. "We must have a bit of a fight, but I don't care about going on long," said Tweedledum. "What's the time now?" Tweedledee looked at his watch and said, "4:30. "Let's fight till 6, and then have dinner," said Tweedledum. "Very well," the other said, rather sadly. "And she can watch us, only you'd better not come very close," he added. "I generally hit everything I can see, and I get really excited." "And I hit everything within reach," cried Tweedledum, "whether I can see it or not." Alice laughed. "You must hit the trees pretty often, I should think," she said. Tweedledum looked round him with a satisfied smile. "I don't suppose," he said, "there'll be a tree left standing for ever so far round by the time we've finished." "And all about a rattle," said Alice, still hoping to make them a little ashamed of fighting for such a trifle. "I shouldn't have minded it so much," said Tweedledum, "if it hadn't been a new one." "I wish the monstrous crow would come," thought Alice. "There's only one word, you know," Tweedledum said to his brother, "but you can have the umbrella. It's quite as sharp. Only we must begin quick. It's getting as dark as it can." "And darker," said Tweedledee. It was getting dark so suddenly that Alice thought there must be a thunderstorm coming on. "What a thick black cloud that is," she said, "and how fast it comes. Why, I do believe it's got wings." "It's the crow!" Tweedledum cried out in a shrill voice of alarm, and the two brothers took their heels and were out of sight in a moment. Alice ran a little way into the wood and stopped under a large tree. "It can never get at me here," she thought. "It's far too large to squeeze itself in among the trees, but I wish it wouldn't flap its wings so. It makes quite a hurricane in the wood. Here's somebody's shawl being blown away." Chapter 5: Wool and Water. She caught the shawl as she spoke, and looked about for the owner. In another moment the White Queen came running wildly through the wood, with both arms stretched out wide, as if she were flying, and Alice very civilly went to meet her with the shawl. "I'm very glad I happened to be in the way," Alice said, as she helped her put on the shawl again. The White Queen only looked at her in a helpless, frightened sort of way, and kept repeating something in a whisper to herself that sounded like "bread and butter, bread and butter, bread and butter," and Alice felt that there was to be any conversation at all, she must manage it herself, so she began rather timidly. "Am I addressing the White Queen?" "Well, yes, if you call that dressing," the Queen said. "It isn't my notion of the thing at all." Alice thought it would never do to have an argument at the very beginning of their conversation, so she smiled and said, "If your Majesty will only tell me the right way to begin, I'll do it as well as I can." "But I don't want it done at all," groaned the poor Queen. "I've been dressing myself for the last 2 hours." It would have been all the better, as it seemed to Alice, if she had got someone else to dress her. She was so dreadfully untidy. "Every single thing's crooked," Alice thought to herself, "and she's all over pins. May I put you a shawl straight for you?" she added aloud. "I don't know what's the matter with it," the Queen said in a melancholy voice. "It's out of temper. I think I've pinned it here, and I've pinned it there, but there's no pleasing it. I can't go straight, you know, if you pin it all on one side. It can't go straight if you pin it all on one side," Alice said, and she gently put it right for her. "And dear me, what a state your hair is in!" "The brush was got all tangled in it," the Queen said with a sigh, and I lost the comb yesterday. Alice carefully released the brush and did her best to get the hair in order. Come, you look rather better now, she said, after altering most of the pins, but really you should have a lady's maid. I'm sure I'll take you with my pleasure, the Queen said. 2 pence a week, and jam every other day. Alice couldn't help laughing as she said, I don't want I don't want you to hire me, and I don't care for jam. It's very good, jam, said the Queen. Well, I don't want any today, at any rate. You couldn't have it if you did want it, the Queen said. The rule is jam tomorrow and jam yesterday, but never jam today. It must come sometimes to jam today, Alice objected. No, it can't, said the Queen. It's jam every other day. Today and isn't any other day, you know. I don't understand you, said Alice. It's dreadfully confusing. That's the effect of living backwards, the Queen said kindly. It always makes one little giddy at first. Living backwards, Alice repeated in a great astonishment. I never heard of such a thing. But there's one great advantage in it, that one's memory works both ways. I'm sure mine only works one way, Alice remarked. I can't remember things before they happen. It's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards, the Queen remarked. What a sort of thing do you remember best? Alice ventured to ask. Oh, the things that happened week after next, the Queen replied in a careless tone. For instance, now, she went on, sticking a large piece of plaster on her finger as she spoke. There's the King's messenger. He's in prison now, being punished, and the trial doesn't even begin till next Wednesday, and of course the crime comes last of all. Suppose he never commits the crime, said Alice. That would be all the better, wouldn't it? The Queen said, as she bound the plaster round her finger with a bit of ribbon. Alice felt there was no denying that. Of course, it would be all the better, she said, but it wouldn't be all the better his being punished. You're wrong there, at any rate, said the Queen. Were you ever punished? Only for faults, said Alice. And you were all the better for it, I know, the Queen said triumphantly. Yes, but then I had done the things I was punished for, said Alice. That makes all the difference. But if you hadn't done them, the Queen said, that would have been better still, better and better and better. Her voice went higher with each better, till it got quite to a squeak at last. Alice was just beginning to say, there's a mistake somewhere, when the Queen began screaming so loudly that she had to leave the sentence unfinished. Oh, 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 shouted the Queen, shaking her hand about as if she wanted to shake it off. My finger's bleeding. Oh, oh, oh. Her screams were so exactly like the whistle of a steam engine that Alice had to hold both her hands over her ears. What's the matter? She said, as soon as there was a chance of making herself heard. Have you pricked your finger? I haven't pricked it yet, the Queen said, but I soon shall. Oh, oh, oh. When do you expect to do it? Alice asked, feeling very much inclined to laugh. When I fasten my shawl again, the poor Queen groaned out. The brooch will come undone directly. Oh, oh, oh. As she said the words, the brooch flew open, and the Queen clutched wildly at it and tried to clasp it again. Take care, cried Alice. You're holding it all crooked. And she caught up the brooch, but it was too late. The pin had slipped, and the Queen had pricked her finger. That accounts for the bleeding, you see, she said to Alice with a smile. Now, you understand the way things happen here. But why don't you scream now? Alice asked, holding her hands ready to put over her ears again. Why, I've done all the screaming already, said the Queen. What would be the good of having it all over again? By this time it was getting light. The crow must have flown away, I think, said Alice. I'm so glad it's gone. I thought it was the night coming on. I wish I could manage to be glad, the Queen said. Only I never can remember the rule. You must be very happy living in this wood and being glad whenever you like. Only it's very lonely here, Alice said in a melancholy voice, and at the thought of her loneliness, 2 large tears came rolling down her cheeks. Oh, don't go on like that, cried the poor queen, wringing her hands in despair. Consider that a great girl you are. Consider what a long way you've come today. Consider that what o'clock it is. Consider anything, only please don't cry. Alice could not help laughing at this, even in the midst of her tears. Can you keep from crying by considering things? She asked. That's the way it's done, the Queen said with great decision. Nobody can do two things at once, you know. Let's consider your age to begin with. How old are you? Um, I am 7.5, exactly. You needn't say exactly, the Queen remarked. I can believe it without that. Now I'll give you something to believe. I'm just 101, 5 months and a day. I can't believe that, said Alice. Can't you? The Queen said in a pitying tone. Try again, draw a long breath, and shut your eyes. Alice laughed. There's no use trying, she said. One can't believe impossible things. I dare say you haven't had much practice, said the Queen. When I was your age, I always did it for half an hour a day. Why, sometimes I've believed as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. There goes the shawl again. The brooch had come undone as she spoke, and a sudden gust of wind blew the Queen's shawl across the little brook. The Queen spread out her arms again and went flying after it, and this time she succeeded in catching it for herself. I've got it, she cried in a triumphant tone. Now you shall see me pin it on again, all by myself. Then I hope your finger is better now, Alice said very politely as she crossed the little brook after the Queen. Oh, much better, cried the Queen, her voice rising to a squeak as she went on. Much better, better, better. The last word ending in a long bleat, so like a sheep that Alice quite started. She looked at the Queen, who seemed to have suddenly wrapped herself up in wool. Alice rubbed her eyes and looked again. She couldn't make out what had happened at all. Was she in a shop? And was it really a sheep that was sitting on the other side of the counter? Rub as she could make nothing more of it. She was in a little dark shop, leaning with her elbows on the counter, and opposite to her was an old sheep sitting in an armchair, knitting, and every now and then leaving off to look at her through the great pair of spectacles. What is it you want to buy? The sheep said at last, looking up for a moment from her knitting. I don't quite know yet, Alice said very gently. I should like to look all around me first, if I might. You may look in front of you, and on both sides, if you like, said the sheep, but you can't look all around you unless you've got eyes at the back of your head. But these, as it happened, Alice had not got. She contented herself with turning around and looking at the shelves as she came to them. The shop seemed to be full of all manner of curious things, but the oddest part of it all was that whenever she looked hard at any shelf to make out exactly what it had on it, the particular shelf was always quite empty, though the others around it were crowded as full as they could hold. Things flow about so here, she said, at last in a plaintive tone. After she had spent a minute or so in vainly pursuing a large bright thing that looked sometimes like a doll and sometimes like a workbox, and was always in the shelf next above the next above the next one she was looking at. And this one is the most provoking of all. But I'll tell you what, she added, as sudden thought struck her. I'll follow it up to the very top shelf of all. It'll puzzle, it'll go through the ceiling, I expect. But even this plan failed. The thing went through the ceiling as quietly as possible, as if it were quite used to it. Are you a child or a teetotum? The sheep said, as she took up another pair of needles. You'll make me giddy soon if you go on turning around like that. She was now working with 14 pairs at once, and Alice couldn't help looking at her in great astonishment. How can she knit with so many? A puzzled child thought to herself. She gets more and more like a porcupine every minute. Can you row? The sheep asked, handing her a pair of knitting needles as she spoke. Yes, a little, but not on land, and not with needles, Alice was beginning to say, when suddenly the needles turned into oars in her hands, and she found they were in a little boat, gliding along between banks. So there was nothing for it but to do her best. Feather, cried the sheep as she took up another pair of needles. This didn't sound like a remark that needed any answer, so Alice said nothing but pulled away. There was something very queer about the water, she thought, as every now and then the oars got fast in it and would hardly come out again. Feather, Feather, the sheep cried again, taking more needles. You'll be catching a crab directly. A dear little crab, thought Alice. I should like that. Didn't you hear me say feather? The sheep cried angrily, taking up quite a bunch of needles. Indeed I did, said Alice. You've said it very often and very loud. Please, where are the crabs? In the water, of course, said the sheep, sticking some of the needles into her hair as her hands were full. Feather, I say. Why do you say feather so often? Alice asked, at the last rather vexed. I'm not a bird. You are, said the sheep. You're a little goose. This offended Alice a little, so there was no more conversation for a minute or two, while the boat glided gently on. Sometimes among the beds of weeds, which made the oars stick fast in the water, worse than ever, and sometimes under trees, but always with the same tall river banks frowning over their heads. Oh, please, there are some scented rushes, Alice cried in a sudden transport of delight. There really are, and such beauties. You needn't say please to me about 'em, the sheep said, without looking up from her knitting. I didn't put 'em there, and I'm not going to take 'em away. No, but I meant, please, may we wait and pick some? Alice pleaded. If you don't mind stopping the boat for a minute. How am I to stop it? Said the sheep. If you leave off rowing, it'll stop of itself. So the boat was left to drift down the stream as it would, till it glided gently in among the waving rushes, and then the little sleeves were carefully rolled up, and the little arms were plunged in elbow deep to get the rushes a good long way down before breaking them off, and for a while Alice forgot all about the sheep and the knitting, as she bent over the side of the boat with just the ends of her tangled hair dipping into the water, while the bright, eager eyes she caught at one bunch after another of the darling scented rushes. I only hope the boat won't tip over, she said to herself. Oh, what a lovely one, only I couldn't quite reach it, and it certainly did seem a little provoking, almost as if it happened on purpose, she thought, that though she that though she managed to pick plenty of beautiful rushes as the boat glided by, there was always a more lovely one that she couldn't reach. The prettiest are always farther away, she said at last, with a sigh at this obscenity of the rushes in growing so far off, with flushed cheeks and dripping hair and hands, and scrambled back into her place and began to arrange her new-found treasures. What mattered to her just then that the rushes had begun to fade and to lose all their scent and beauty from the very moment she picked them. Even real scented rushes, you know, last only a little while, and these, being dream rushes, melted away almost like snow as they lay in heaps at her feet. But Alice hardly noticed this. There were so many other curious things to think about. They hadn't gone much farther before the blade of one of the oars got fast in the water and wouldn't come out again, so Alice explained it afterwards, and the consequence was that the handle of it caught her under the chin, and in spite of a series of little shrieks of "Oh, oh, oh" from poor Alice, it swept her straight off the seat and down among the heap of rushes. However, she wasn't hurt, and was soon up again. The sheep went on with her knitting all the while, just as if nothing had happened. That's a very nice crab you caught, she remarked as Alice got back into her place, very much relieved to find herself still in the boat. Was it? I didn't see it, said Alice, peeping cautiously over the side of the boat into the dark water. I wish it hadn't let go. I should like to see the little crab to take home with me. But the sheep only laughed scornfully and went on with her knitting. And there are many crabs here, said Alice. Are there many crabs here? Crabs and all sorts of things, said the sheep. Plenty of choice. Only make up your mind. Now, what do you want to buy? To buy, Alice echoed in a tone that was half astonished and half frightened, for the oars and the boat and the river had vanished all in a moment, and she was back again in the little dark shop. I should like to buy an egg, please, she said timidly. How do you sell them? 5 pence farthing for one, 2 pence for two, the sheep replied. Then two are cheaper than one? Alice said in a surprised tone, taking out her purse. Only you must eat them both if you buy two, said the sheep. Then I'll have one, please, said Alice as she put the money down on the counter. For she thought to herself, they mightn't be at all nice, you know. The sheep took the money and put it away in a box. Then she said, I never put things into people's hands. That would never do. You must get it for yourself. And so saying, she went off to work the other end of the shop and set the egg upright on a shelf. I wonder why it wouldn't do, thought Alice, as she groped her way among the tables and chairs, for the shop was very dark towards the end. The egg seems to get further away the more I walk towards it. Let me see. Is this a chair? Why, it's got branches. I declare, how very odd to find trees growing here. And actually, here's a little brook. Well, this is very queerest shop I ever saw. Queerest. So she went on, wondering more and more at every step, at everything turned into a tree, the moment she came up to it, and quite expected the egg to do the same. Chapter 6. Humpty Dumpty. However, the egg only got larger and more human. When she had come within a few yards of it, she saw that it had eyes and a nose and a mouth, and she had come close to it. She very clearly saw that it was Humpty Dumpty himself. It can't be anybody else, she said to herself. I'm certain of it, as if his name were written all over his face. It might have been written 100 times easily on that enormous face. Humpty Dumpty was sitting with his legs crossed like a Turk on top of a high wall, such a narrow one that Alice quite wondered how he could keep his balance, and as his eyes were steadily fixed in the opposite direction, and he didn't take the least notice of her, she thought he must be stuffed figure after all. And how exactly like an egg he is, she said aloud, standing with her hands ready to catch him, for she was every moment expecting him to fall. It's very provoking, Humpty Dumpty said after a long silence, looking away from Alice as he spoke, to be called an egg. Very. I said you looked like an egg, sir, Alice gently explained, and some eggs are very pretty, you know, she added, hoping to turn her remark into a sort of compliment. Some people, said Humpty Dumpty, looking away from her as usual, have no more sense than a baby. Alice didn't know what to say to this. It wasn't at all like conversation, she thought, as he never said anything to her. In fact, his last remark was evidently addressed to a tree, so she stood and softly repeated to herself, Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty in his place again. That last line is much too long for the poetry, she added, almost aloud, forgetting that Humpty Dumpty would hear her. Don't stand there chattering to yourself like that, Humpty Dumpty said, looking at her for the first time. But tell me your name and your business. My name is Alice, but it's a stupid enough name, Humpty Dumpty interrupted impatiently. What does it mean? Must a name mean something? Alice asked doubtfully. Of course it must, Humpty Dumpty said with a short laugh. My name means the shape I am, and a good handsome shape it is too. With a name like yours, you might be any shape. Almost. Why do you sit out here all alone? Said Alice, not wishing to begin an argument. Why, because there's nobody here with me, cried Humpty Dumpty. Did you think I didn't know the answer to that? Ask another. Don't you think you'd be safer down on the ground? Alice went on, not with any idea of making another riddle, but simply in her good-natured anxiety for queer creature. That wall is so very narrow. What tremendously easy riddles you ask, Humpty Dumpty growled out. Of course I don't think so. Why, if ever I did fall off, which there's no chance of, but if I did... Here he pursed his lips and looked so solemn and grand that Alice could hardly help but laughing. If I did fall, he went on, the king has promised me, he may turn pale, if you like. If you'd think I was going to say that, did you? The king promised me, which is with his very own mouth, yes, I know, a little trumpy, to send all his horses and all his men, Alice interrupted rather unwisely. Now I declare that's too bad, Humpty Dumpty cried, breaking into a sudden passion. You've been listening at doors and behind trees and down chimneys, or you couldn't have known it. I haven't indeed, Alice said very gently. It's in a book. Ah, well, they may write such things in a book, Humpty Dumpty said in a calmer tone. That's what you call a history of England, that is. Now, take a good look at me. I'm one that has spoken to a king, I am. Mayhap you'll never see such another, and to show you I'm not proud, you may shake hands with me. And he grinned almost from ear to ear as he leant forwards, and, as nearly as possible, fell off the wall in doing so, and offered Alice his hand. She watched him a little anxiously as she took it. If he smiled much more, the ends of his mouth might meet behind, she thought. And then, I don't know what would happen to his head. I'm afraid it would come off. Yes, all his horses and all his men, Humpty Dumpty went on. They'd pick me up again in a minute, they would. However, this conversation is going on a little too fast. Let's go back to the last remark but one. But I'm afraid I can't remember it, Alice said very politely. In that case, we start fresh, said Humpty Dumpty, and it's my turn to choose a subject. He talks about it just as if he was a game, thought Alice. So here's a question for you. How old did you say you were? Alice made a short calculation and said 7 years and 6 months. Wrong! 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 Humpty Dumpty exclaimed triumphantly. You never said a word like it. I thought you meant how old are you, Alice explained. If I did, I meant that I'd have said it, said Humpty Dumpty. Alice didn't want to begin another argument, so she said nothing. 7 years and 6 months, Humpty Dumpty repeated thoughtfully. An uncomfortable sort of age. Now, if you had asked my advice, I'd have said leave off at 7, but it's too late now. I never ask advice about growing, Alice said indignantly. Too proud? The other inquired. Alice felt even more indignant at the suggestion. I mean, she said, that once I can't help growing older. One can't, perhaps, said Humpty Dumpty, but two can. With proper assistance, you might have left off at 7. What a beautiful belt you've got on, Alice suddenly remarked. They had quite enough of the subject of age, she thought, and if they really were to take turns in choosing subjects, it was her turn now. At least, she corrected herself on the second thoughts. A beautiful cravat, I should have said. No, a belt. I mean... Ooh, I beg your pardon, she added in dismay. For Humpty Dumpty looked thoroughly offended, and she began to wish she hadn't chosen that subject. If I only knew, she thought to herself, which was the neck and which was the waist. Evidently, Trumpety Dumpety was very angry, though he said nothing for a minute or two. When he did speak again, it was in a deep growl. "It is a most provoking thing," he said at last, "when a person doesn't know a cravat from a belt." "I know it's very ignorant of me," Alice said in so humble a tone that Humpty Dumpty relented. "It's a cravat, child, and a beautiful one. Beautiful. As you say, it's a present from the White King and Queen. There now." "Is it really?" said Alice, quite pleased to find that she had chosen a good subject after all. "They gave it to me," Humpty Dumpty continued thoughtfully, as he crossed one knee over the other and clasped his hands round it. "They gave it to me for an unbirthday present." "I beg your pardon," Alice said with a puzzled air. "I'm not offended," said Humpty Dumpty. "I mean, what is an unbirthday present?" "A present given when it isn't your birthday, of course." Alice considered a little. "I like birthday presents best," she said at last. "You don't know what you're talking about," cried Humpty Dumpty. "How many days are there in a year?" 365, said Alice. "And how many birthdays do you have?" "One." "And if you take one from 365, what remains?" 364, of course. Humpty Dumpty looked doubtful. "I'd rather see that done on paper, okay?" he said. Alice couldn't help smiling as she took out her memorandum book and worked the sum for him. Humpty Dumpty took the book and looked at it carefully. "This seems to be done right," he began. "You're holding it upside down," Alice interrupted. "To be sure, I was," Humpty Dumpty said gaily, as she turned it around for him. "I thought it looked a little queer. As I was saying, that seems to be done right, though I haven't time to look it over thoroughly for now. And that shows that there are 364 days that you might get an unbirthday present." "Certainly," said Alice. "And only one for birthday presents. You know, there's glory for you." "I don't know what you mean by glory," Alice said. Humpty Dumpty smiled contemptuously. "Of course you don't, till I tell you. I meant there's a nice knockdown argument for you." "But glory doesn't mean a nice knockdown argument," Alice objected. "When I use a word," Humpty Dumpty said in a rather scornful tone, "it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less." "The question is," said Alice, "whether you can make words mean so many different things." "The question is, Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master, that's all." Alice was so much puzzled to say anything, so after a minute Humpty Dumpty began again. "They've a temper, some of them, particularly verbs. They're the proudest. Adjectives you can do anything with, but not verbs. However, I can imagine the whole lot of them imperturbably. That's what I say." "Would you tell me, please," said Alice, "what that means?" "Now you talk like a reasonable child," said Humpty Dumpty, looking very much pleased. "I meant by impenetrably that we've had enough of the subject, and it would just as well if you'd mention what you mean to do next, as I suppose you don't mean to stop here all the rest of your life." "That's a great deal to make out of one word," Alice said in a thoughtful tone. "When I make a word, I do a lot of work like that," said Humpty Dumpty. "I always pay it extra." "Oh," said Alice. She was too much puzzled to make any other remark. "Ah, you should see 'em come round me that Saturday night," Humpty Dumpty went on, wagging his head gravely from side to side. "For to get their wages, you know." Alice didn't venture to ask what he paid for them, and so, you see, I can't tell you. You seem very clever at explaining words, sir, said Alice. Would you kindly tell me the meaning of the poem called The Jabberwocky? Let's hear it, said Humpty Dumpty. I can explain all poems that were ever invented and a good many that haven't been invented just yet. This sounded very hopeful, so Alice repeated the first verse. "'Twas brillig, and the slithy loves did gyre and gimble in the wabe. All miss me were the borogoves, and the mome raths outgrabe." That's enough to begin with, Humpty Dumpty interrupted. There are plenty of hard words there. Brillig means 4 o'clock in the afternoon, the time when you begin broiling things for dinner. That'll do very well, said Alice. And slithy? Well, slithy means lithe and slimy. Lithe is the same as active, as it's like portmanteau, where two meanings packed up into one word. Ah, I see it now, Alice remarked thoughtfully. And what are toves? Well, toves are something like badgers. They're something like lizards. And they're something like corkscrews. They must be very curious looking creatures. They are that, said Humpty Dumpty. Also, they make their nests under sundials. Also, they live on cheese. And what is the gyre and to gimble? To gyre is to go round and round like a gyroscope. To gimble is to make holes like a gimlet. And the wabe is the grass plot around the sundial, I suppose, said Alice, surprised at her own ingenuity. Of course it's called a wabe, because it goes a long way before it, and a long way behind it, and a long way beyond it on each side, Alice added. Exactly. Well then, Misme is flimsy and miserable. There's another portmanteau for you. And a borogrove is a thin, shabby-looking bird. Lots of birds, with its feathers sticking out all round, something like a mop. And then a mome rath, said Alice. I'm afraid I'm giving you a great deal of trouble. Well, a rath is a sort of green pig, but mome I'm not certain about. I think it's a short for from home, meaning that they'd lost their way. And what does outgrabe mean? Well, outgrabbing is something between bellowing and whistling, with a kind of sneeze in the middle. However, you'll hear it done, maybe down in the wood yonder, and when you've heard it once, you'll be quite content. Who's been repeating all the hard stuff to you? I read it in a book, said Alice, but I had some poetry repeated to me much easier than that. By Tweedledee, I think it was. As to poetry, said Humpty Dumpty, stretching out one of his great hands. I can repeat poetry as well as other folk, if it comes to that. Oh, it needn't come to that, Alice hastily said, hoping to keep him from beginning. The piece I'm going to repeat, she went on without noticing her remark, was written entirely for your amusement. Alice felt that in that case she really ought to listen to it, so she sat down and said, "Thank you," rather sadly. In winter, when the fields are white, I sing this song for your delight. Only I don't sing it, he added, as an explanation. I see you don't, said Alice. If you can see whether I'm singing or not, you've sharper eyes than most, Humpty Dumpty remarked severely. Alice was silent. In spring, when woods are getting green, I'll tell you what I mean. Thank you very much, said Alice. In summer, when the days are long, perhaps you'll understand the song. In autumn, when leaves are brown, take the pen and ink and write it down. I will, if I can remember. It's so long, said Alice. You needn't go on making remarks like that. Humpty Dumpty said. "They're not sensible, and they put me out. I sent a message to the fish. I told them this was what I wish. The little fishes of the sea, they sent an answer back to me. The little fishes' answer was, 'We cannot do it, sir, because.'" "I'm afraid I don't quite understand," said Alice. It gets easier further on," Humpty Dumpty replied. "I sent them again to say, it will be better to obey. The fishes answered with a grin, 'Why, what a temper you are in! I hold them once, I hold them twice. They would not listen to advice. I took a kettle large and new, fit for the deed I had to do. My heart went hop, my heart went thump. I filled the kettle at the pump. Then some came to me and said the little fishes are in bed. I said to him, I said it plain, then you must wake them up again. I said it very loud and very clear. I went and shouted it in the ear." Humpty Dumpty raised his voice almost to a scream as he repeated this verse, and Alice thought with a shudder, "I wouldn't have been the messenger for anything." But he was very stiff and proud. He said, "You needn't shout so loud." And he was very proud and stiff and said, "I'd go and wake them if." I took the corkscrew from the shelf. I went to wake them by myself. And when I found the door was locked, I pulled and pushed and kicked and knocked, and was found on the floor was shut. I tried to turn the handle, but there was a long pause. "Is that all?" Alice asked timidly. "That's all," said Humpty Dumpty. "Goodbye." This was rather sudden, Alice thought, but after such a very strong hint that she ought to be going, she felt that it would hardly be civil to say, so she got up and held out her hand. "Goodbye, till we meet again," she said as cheerfully as she could. "I shouldn't know you again if we did meet," Humpty Dumpty replied in a discontented tone, giving her one of his fingers to shake. "You're so exactly like other people." "The face is what goes by generally," Alice remarked in a thoughtful tone. "That's just what I complain of," said Humpty Dumpty. "Your face is the same as everybody has, 2 eyes, so, marking the place in the air with his thumb. Nose in the middle, mouth under. It's always the same: man, person, woman, camera, TV. Now, if you had 2 eyes on the same side as the nose, for instance, or the mouth at the top, that would be the same. That would be some help." "It wouldn't look nice," Alice objected, but Humpty Dumpty only shut his eyes and said, "Wait till you've tried." Alice waited a minute to see if he would speak again, but as he never opened his eyes or took any further notice of her, she said "goodbye" once more, and getting no answer to this, she quietly walked away, but she couldn't help saying to herself as she went on, "Of all the unsatisfactory—" She repeated this aloud, as it was a great comfort to have such a long word to say. "Of all the unsatisfactory people I ever met—" She never finished the sentence, for at this moment a heavy crash shook the forest from end to end. That is where we end for the evening. Did you like my trumpety dumpety? Let me just go through and say, let me just see what we have here. Welcome, Nathan and Courtney. Let's go back. Let's see. Here we go. Mary Jane King, hello. Class tomorrow. I'm actually awake. Nice weather in Ohio. Very good. Joan Benson, good evening. Hello. Mary Jane, I remember that part. Buck says, "We're a little later than I thought." Oh, yes. Hello. Welcome. I'm so glad that you're here. Courtney and Nathan. When I was in grade school, I played the rabbit and had the line, I'm late for a very important date. And now I'm 50 years later. I have not been on time for anything. I cursed myself. Oh, that's funny. Sam Zog says, "Welcome, Nathan and Courtney. Very nice lecture. Hello again. Hope you're doing well, sir. Thank you, Richard Goulet." Mary Jane, Trump, you're so funny. Joan Benson, LOL, Trump, so funny. The trumpety dumpety voice made me smile. Special power, that is so freaking hilarious. Special power, hand gesture makes it perfect. Mary Jane King says Trump could have said all this. I actually think he did. Sam Zog gives a laughy face. Mary Jane, you are so right. Casey Magic Girl, smiley, smiley. Joan Benson, smile. Special power, smile. Seabuck, smile. Excellent impression. Thank you. Mary Jane, I guess the people who called him Humpty Dumpty had, through the looking glass in mind, more education than I realized. Humpty, too hilarious. Thank you so much for the great evening. You're welcome. Empress Heather, hello. Casey Magic Girl, loved it. Such a great reading, made my night quite soothing. Empress, hey, hello everybody. So that was fun. I was going to try not to do my Trump voice, but I just couldn't get over. I make the words whatever I want them to mean. Anyway, thank you everyone for joining me tonight. I really enjoyed having you here. And tomorrow night, no, I'm sorry, not tomorrow night. Next week, actually, we will be continuing on with, what is it, chapter 7, and it's the Lion and the Unicorn. We may have 2 more nights of this version. I will try to I'll post about it. So I'll read a little bit more maybe this coming week, since I don't really have a whole lot going on as far as anything in the evening. I will try to read if we can, and I'll post about it. So keep an eye out. Go onto my Facebook page. You can always see. I always post about 3 or 4 hours beforehand. Again, thank you for all of the love, the comments, the shares, the likes. If you are enjoying the channel and I bring you joy, and only if it doesn't impede upon you, a great way of support is to go to the patreon.com/thegentlemanpsychic, or through my PayPal. That helps a lot too. I have to do some restructuring. I haven't been on the site for a while, so I need to go on and do some restructuring. But nonetheless, I appreciate each and every one of you. Thank you so much for spending your evening with me. And until next time, good night. Love always.